Let's do it again. A day like Mother's Day to church is always a typical challenge because not everyone is in the same place in terms of remembering their mother. The blessing that we'll use at the end of the liturgy is meant to, in a way, encompass that, although the many different ways that this day's experience can't be fully encompassed by a list of things, but at least an attempt to it. It's taken me, my own mother's death, which happened 7 years ago at the end of this month, to finally understand how bittersweet a day like this is for many. Bittersweet meaning that there's always some pain, there's always some loss, and sweet meaning there's always something beautiful that's present, but the mixture of it is so different in different people. The first really idea that I had that Mother's Day could be a bittersweet experience was in my second year at the seminary at St. Meinrad. On Mother's Day weekend, it was in the middle of our final exams, and so literally nobody went home. And so the whole seminary community was there. We went for Sunday Mass that morning, and then the only people there are us, and then the monks who were priests on the faculty for the seminary. That was our entirety of Sunday Mass. Someone got the idea of bringing white roses for everybody's mother, and the thought would be that they could take it to their mother, take a picture of it, and show it to their mother. Several of the students out in the assembly had already lost their mothers and were overwhelmed by it, and not in a particular good way. One actually walked out and couldn't bear to stay in there. And everyone else sort of scratched their heads, why is that so upsetting or something, but a real lesson was learned there, which is that not everybody greets Mother's Day with great joy. They may, in fact, greet it with great sadness and great sorrow, and seeing others around them celebrate, crowd into too many restaurants, put pictures of everybody up on the internet, and not have some idea that other people find it bittersweet, more bitter than sweet. If you've attended my funerals, there's at least an image that I'm going to use that I really like, that I've used often now, not all the time, but often in funerals where I thought the image was relevant. It starts with a song from Steve Wariner that comes from what I call my country music phase. I never paid attention to country music until 1990. Then it became vogue, it was popular. Garth Brooks, all that stuff was happening. So I began to listen and buy, consume, and really enjoy a huge variety of it. By the end of the 90s, I'd gotten over that, and I've moved since then. But I still kind of had this frozen decade of country music on my playlist. One particular song always stood out for me, and it's still on numerous ones of my playlists. A song by a country artist named Steve Wariner, saying that there's holes in the floor of heaven. Now, country music is pretty structured, it's pretty predictable, and this song, like most country music songs, has a 3-verse, 3-chorus structure. The song is bittersweet, more bitter than sweet, and as a result, there's another predictable part of the trajectory. It will start with something less bitter, it will move to something that's bitterer, and then the bitterest will be at the ending. It's a progression of bitterness and sadness, but a really lovely song. It goes like this. It starts out with a young boy who's 8 years old, and his grandmother has just died, but he's sad, blowing out the candles on his birthday cake. And then as the voice says that the rain starts pouring down, and his mother grabs him by the arm and says, "Don't be sad, child. I know Mama, your grandmother's watching now." And here's the chorus. "There are holes in the floor of heaven, and her tears are pouring down. That's how I know she's watching, wishing she could be here now. Sometimes when you're lonely, remember she can see. There are holes in the floor of heaven, and she's watching over you and me." I told you there was a progression. Now, years go by as they sing the verse, several decades in fact, and you learn that he's now a young man and he's met a girl who took his name. This is so that it will rhyme, and that way we know that he's now married to the love of his life. And then he says, "I thought that we would grow old together." That's the warning. "Lord, I sure do miss her now." You know that there's now a young husband grieving over the all too soon loss of his bride, the love of his life. There are holes in the floor of heaven, and her tears are pouring down. That's how I know she's watching, wishing she could be here now. Sometimes when I'm lonely, I remember she can see. There are holes in the floor of heaven, and she's watching over you and me. Did I mention there's a third verse? There is a third verse, and the third verse actually intensifies these really powerful emotions. The song's very emotional to listen to. And so in the third verse, the dad is at his daughter's wedding, and he's walking her down the aisle. Remember the rhyming structure. He says, I wish her mother was here to see her beautiful smile. They throw the rice, they ring the bells, and they walk out into the rain. And suddenly the rain starts pouring down. The daughter looks at her dad and grabs his hand and says, Daddy, don't be sad. I know Mama's watching now. There are holes in the floor of heaven, and her tears are pouring down. That's how I know she's watching, wishing she could be here now. Sometimes when I'm lonely, I remember she can see. There are holes in the floor of heaven, and she's watching over you and me. By now you can tell, since I know it by heart, I really love this song. I love the powerful emotion that's evoked in the hearing. It will be more evocative than my orating as I'm doing this evening, but it really does what you call push the button. But now I'm obliged to tell you that the song is great country music, but it is terrible theology. In other words, there are no holes in the floor of heaven. Heaven is not Swiss cheese. And not only that, our loved ones that are in heaven are not crying, wishing they could be here now. Where do I get this from? The book of Revelation, our second reading. For Catholics have a long, twisted history about the book of Revelation. Mistakenly, some of them think it's a, quote, Protestant book, and don't realize it was written at the end of the 1st century by John, and there was no such thing as Protestantism then. Invariably, in our lifetimes, the Protestant churches have been more willing to use the rather vivid imagery of the book of Revelation in their preaching and lots of things that they do, and you really get scant portions of it in the Catholic corpus in our lectionary. But the reality is the book of Revelation is the last of the apostles, John, who's exiled to the Isle of Patmos. The others have been martyred. He is not going to die a martyr's death, but he's going to die a prisoner on this island. But he's given the gift of revelation. And the gift of revelation happens because the era of persecution has begun. We get a hint of it in that first reading in Acts of the Apostles, when they visit the town and say that God is now going to work through the Gentiles, and people become so upset that they're thrown out of the town, and a great persecution begins. All the vivid imagery, the beast and the dragons and the fire and the destruction that so populates most of the book of Revelation is meant to be a literary way to understand the awful persecution that was taking place in the Christian church. And John was leaving people a message that this persecution would not have the final answer, that this evil would not have the final answer. And right there in the reading that we got this evening from chapter 7, early on in Revelation, this beautiful chapter is going to be expanded in chapter 21, not our reading tonight, but they will come back to that phrase again. It's really powerful. First, there's a notion that there's a multitude in heaven. You hear the number 144,000, which is the 12 tribes, with the prime number 12, whatever, it's simply imagery. And then there's another one, multitudes, so many of every race, people, creed, and nation, they can't be found. And they are washing their robes white in the blood of the Lamb. Make no mistake about this imagery. For those who've been persecuted, those who have suffered, those who've experienced hardship, and this isn't just first century Israel, this is every moment in human history. We experience our own version of persecution, our own experience of hardship, our experience of suffering. Sometimes we live through the suffering of others, and other times our suffering is something that manifests itself to others. For us, it seems endless. It doesn't seem it's going to go away. It seems that suffering always has the upper hand. And that's what this phrase says. They wash their robes white and clean in the blood of the Lamb. You see, the wounds don't disappear. The suffering, the wounds of the suffering remain. When Jesus appeared to his apostles, he showed them the nail marks. He showed them the gash in his side. He said, see that I'm not a ghost, I'm not a spirit. But what he really wanted them to see was that suffering did not have the final word. His wounds no longer wounded. His robes had been washed in the blood of the Lamb, and he was experiencing an ecstasy that you and I can only imagine. Then he says in Revelation, when we were hearing the reading this evening, I will wipe every tear from their eyes. Later in chapter 21, he'll expand on that, repeat it again. I will wipe every tear from their eyes, and there will be no more suffering. There will be no more illness. There will be no more sadness. There will be no more destruction. God always gets the final word. So you see, even if there are metaphorical holes in the floor of heaven, it's a biblical truth that our loved ones who are there are not crying, wishing they could be here now. The truth is, we're the ones crying, wishing we could be with them. And to wish that, to desire that, makes us totally human. Jesus knew this. So the night before he died, when he was celebrating that Last Supper with the apostles, but before they sat down at the table, Jesus told the apostles that he was going to go. Most of them didn't understand that. They thought he was like going outside the door, going across the street, going and coming back. They just really didn't grasp what he meant by he was going. And he says, if I go, I'm going to prepare a place for you. And where I am going, you will follow me. And I will come and take you there myself. The words are very important because the apostles will experience the trauma of the crucifixion and then the mystery of his resurrection. And all of that happened in a short period of time, and then ultimately his ascension into heaven, a real sense of his going. But I mentioned this was at the Last Supper, and that the Last Supper, as we all know, the Eucharist we celebrated, was instituted. Jesus looked into the elements, the bread and the wine. He said, take this, all of you, and eat it. This is my body. Take this, all of you, and drink it. This is my blood. By the way, the blood that washes clean the pain of the martyrs, the suffering of the world, blood that's spoken of in those words before the Eucharist. And then finally, the words we're used to hearing, do this in memory of me. Memory, which for many of us is a crutch when we're experiencing grief or suffering. We would really rather not remember it. But you see, in remembering, we are engaging something that is real. Forgetting is not something that's easily done with something that's important to us. And pretending like nothing ever happened to us, this person that we missed really didn't exist, they weren't around, that doesn't work for any one of us. And so all of our grieving involves remembering. But there's an important aspect about memory that I think people don't think about often enough. The act of remembering. I do it on a simple example of my keys, because about 3 to 4 times a day, I cannot remember where my keys are. Now, I live alone and still accuse someone of moving them. There's really no one to move them, so that can't possibly be true. And then when I try to think, where did I last leave them? Well, of course, I can't remember that. That's why I cannot find my keys. And so that real sense then, of memory and forgetting is can be really very challenging, that idea of memory. But you see, memory doesn't really mean losing something and not being able to find it. What memory means is that we capture a past moment and we make it present. And that's what Eucharist is. In Eucharist, the suffering of the Lord is immediately and instantly and in this moment present to us. And you see, it's actually pregnant with great joy, because only through the suffering of the cross can the glory of the resurrection take place. You and I, to have our garments washed in the blood of the Lamb, remember that they will be washed clean, and he will wipe every tear from our eyes, and there'll be no more suffering, no more sadness, and no more sorrow. Each time we celebrate Eucharist together, we experience a moment of memory that is so profound it normally escapes us. That we are experiencing God immediately here, immediately now, more present than he could ever possibly be than he is in that moment, that we have our experience of the sacrament. And so it is when we remember people that we have loved, when we grieve, when we feel sad, when a song like Holes in the Floor of Heaven moves us to tears, that stirring of the memory, what we're doing is taking someone and making them immediately present. You see, that's the goal of memory, to make them present, not to move them away. And in that presence that we have with them, we can engage a connection in a new and profound way, a promise that one day we will be reunited and there will be no more tears and no more sadness. Many of you know that I love the play Angels in America. It takes place over 2 nights, and it first was written and performed in the early 1990s, the most tragic years of my life. I finally got to see that production when it was back on the stage in New York 3 or 4 years ago. The very ending of it, which I know by heart, really deals with these themes of grief, of suffering, of dying, of losing. I always thought these words were powerful from one of the characters. She's on an airplane flying back to San Francisco to start a new phase of her life. So much suffering that she's leaving behind. And she has what I would call a vision. Not quite like John's on the Isle of Patmos. That's scripture, but a real powerful vision nonetheless. She says, souls were rising from the earth far below, souls of the dead, of people who perished from famine, from the war, from the plague. And they floated up like skydivers in reverse, limbs all akimbo, wheeling and spinning. And the souls of the departed joined hands, clasped ankles, and formed a web, a great net of souls. And the outer rim absorbed them and was repaired. Nothing is lost forever. In this world, there is a kind of painful progress, longing for what we've left behind and dreaming ahead. Nothing is lost forever. In the prayers we say at the cemetery, we will see each other again. Our grief will be temporary. Our joy will be eternal. In that same tragic decade of the 1990s for me, I only saw the film one time all the way through, way too emotional to watch it, but I have remembered aspects of it. The film's called Shadowlands, and it tells the story of C.S. Lewis, who late in life as a bachelor fell in love with an American poet, and then rather tragically after they got married, she got cancer and died, and then he went through more profound grief than he'd ever done before. This is a great theologian, a great spiritual writer, yet he was completely gutted by this death of this beautiful woman and gutted by how deeply he felt about it. He had such trouble coming with it, asking the questions everyone asks. How could a loving God allow something like this to happen? What joy can be found in any of this? He ultimately comes to a conclusion at the very end of the film that I think is very powerful, a realization that he has about his profound suffering. He says that the pain now is part of the joy then. And his last words, that's the deal. Well, I'm not going to rephrase C.S. Lewis in the same way that I rephrased Steve Warner's Holes in the Floor of Heaven, but I'm going to suggest a different way to do that ending, which is to say that the pain now is part of the joy to be revealed. That's what Eucharist is all about. The pain now and the joy that will become. A joy that will be eternal. A joy where God says, I will wipe every tear from our eyes. That's the deal.